I think with regard to
Mm,
Ware, most classical theists would look at his description of what he calls relational mutability, and they would immediately recognize that as accidents. And in fact, for Aristotle, relations, um, not subsisting relations like we have in Trinitarian theology, those are not Aristotelian accidents, but relations, especially acquired relations and mutable relations, are always and everywhere that they exist accidents that exist in multi-parted beings. And that was one of my concerns, is that fundamental to Ware's whole reconstruction, where you have this unchanging essence, but you have a changing relation and they're both real within the one God, is that it requires Ware, without even having to say so, it requires that Ware abandon the simplicity of God. And it requires that he abandon the pure actuality of God, because now there are aspects of divine being, namely the relations and the new feelings, that can be actualized in God through the operation of some agent upon him, whether that's you, or one of the angels. Some agent can operate upon God so as to produce in him a new state of being, a new feeling, a new relation. So who causes this newness of being in God? We do, or angels do. Um, so now you have a kind of new conundrum for evangelical Calvinism, which is, if you have newness of being in God, you first have to deny God is without parts, because now there has to be essence plus something over and above divinity.
right.
And then you also have to account for whatever it is that is the sufficient reason for this newness of being in God. What caused it? What made it so? And if you say, like Ware does, and it's not only Ware, by the way, I mean, D.A. Carson speaks this way, G.I. Packer speaks this way, in the New Dictionary of Theology. When you locate it, what you find out is that for all of these guys, the agent of newness of actuality in God is in fact some creature. Now, that might sound, that sounds bad enough. What are you going to do to keep things from completely falling apart if you're a Calvinist? And this is what a lot of modern Calvinists have done. And I think on the face of it, at least I'll confess for myself, as a younger Calvinist, I thought this just had the ring of plausibility. They invoke the doctrine of sovereignty or lordship in the case of John Frame. They invoke something like lordship or sovereignty, and they say, well, it's okay if creatures act upon God so as to produce newness of fill in the blank relation or feeling in him. That's a new actuality of being. It's okay if creatures do this, as long as God is the one controlling this mutualistic and mutabilist relational
Right.
event.
Right.
And as long as you can invoke control, then everything is okay. And don't we know that Calvinism is about nothing if it's not about control? But I think we should question that Calvinism, its doctrine of sovereignty, its doctrine of control, was always a statement about God's relationship to the creature. It was never a statement about odd intra self-control or divine self-lordship over the intrinsic actuality of his own being, so that it was never a question of, like, for instance, the Father's control of the Son or the Spirit. It was never a question of God's control over his own allegedly changing states of being. Lordship and sovereignty were always relative names, relative attributes, we sometimes call them, names we gave to God from the standpoint of the creature who stands under his control. But as soon as you have, so in the Bible, like, sovereignty is always a function of the creator creature distinction.
Yeah.
But what would sovereignty be a function of with God respect to intrinsic acting upon himself? If that, I don't believe that's such a thing, but if that were such a thing, what would establish the sovereignty of God over God? Whereas in Scripture, it's always the doctrine of creation that frames and establishes a sovereignty relationship of God to the creature. What establishes a sovereignty relationship of God over God?
It's
There has to be some kind of distinction. There has to be something in God that's doing the controlling, perhaps the will. There has to be something in God that's being controlled, the emotions, the relations, the other accidental features of being. But at that point, simplicity simplicity is disappearing quickly out of the rearview mirror as soon as you have control
Right.
real distinctions within the Godhead.
James, tell me if I'm following you. I'm virtually certain I am, but I want to be sure. Okay. But the idea of the expression of sovereignty among Calvinists is the expression of the God who remains simple and ase and self-contained in the expression of his sovereignty. What mutualists are describing is the evacuation of such sovereignty in an antecedent act in order then to relate to the creature as sovereign, like a macro creature is sovereign, right?
Yeah.
In other words, their view that on the mutualist view, the expression of sovereignty is really the abdication of the sovereignty of a self-contained God.
I think that that's how it shakes out, though I don't think that that would be how they perceived their position.
Oh, of course. That's the consequence.
Yeah. I think what they might say, though, because in a certain sense, in order for the creature to act as an agent, giving God a new form of being, the creature, as the old saying goes, you can't give what you ain't got. In other words, you've got to have agents can only give what they either formally or virtually possess, right? So that you're going to have to, and by the way, and on the flip side, patients or receivers of being can only receive as new what is lacking to them. To receive a new form of being, like a new emotion or a new relation, for instance, requires as its foundation, it requires, first of all, the absence of that actuality.
Absolutely.
So that, for instance, right now I am seated, I am not currently able to receive the form of being seated, not because I'm not the kind of thing that can be seated, but because I already am seated.
Yes.
So that I can't be changed into or receive the form of being seated because I already have it. So that to receive newness from the creature requires a paucity or a lack of being of some sort in God.
Yes.
The relation or the emotion or what have you. And it also requires that creature have in his possession, either formally or virtually, precisely that form of being that is lacking to God, so as to give it to God.
Yes.
Now, what someone like Frame or Bruce Ware will want to do is to say, yes, but only because God decreed it from all eternity that it would be so. But again, what you're saying is that God is sovereignly authoring his own mutation of being as a finite being. He has to be finite because he has to lack precisely what he receives from the creature.
Right.
He's authoring finitude and mutability for himself.
Brother, you take away the process of Hartshorne and these mutualists, bring those two poles together in an instantaneous dialectical event, and you've got Karl Barth. See, the difference is that Barth actualizes that relation, that mutual reciprocal relation where God wills that relation to the creature in his new accommodated mutualist form, right? But what Barth gives up front, Hegel says, I'll just hold on. Or the Socinians, actually. The Socinians who might be informed by Hegel say, no, wait. What Barth says is realized instantaneously. That gets realized at the end of the age, but in both instances, what is it? It's a God who is in becoming, incorporating a creature into that basic process of becoming with him.
Let me scare you just a little bit. And I never do this, but I'm going to do it now.
I won't show the hairs on my arm, okay? I will not show them. Because
even Barth himself seems to me, and again, there's a lot to Barth that I have not read, and he's so dialectical that I don't doubt that on the very next page he says the opposite of what I read him saying.
Of course, yeah.
That said, even Barth shows an apprehensiveness about allowing the creature itself to be the agent of change in God, so that Barth will say that God, like when Barth denies Barth denies that God is impassible, and he says that God is passible, and he says that God is passible vis-a-vis the creature, but then he sort of qualifies it by saying that God is touching and moving himself in a kind of way that coordinates with the creature's actions, but that the actual agent of change in God, when God changes in relation to the creature, is in fact God himself. This is where it gets scary. You don't even have that much modesty in J.I. Packer or in Bruce Ware.
It is terrifying.
And when Karl Barth is when Karl Barth ends up being, I think he's still wrong because God isn't a self-authored becoming thing. But when Barth attributes less agency to the creature changing God than our conservative evangelical Calvinist friends do, that's the scary thing.
Well, here's what's so scary. They are not Barthians because of a very slender cultural, ecclesial, and social thread. And you let that thread go, you get that out of the way, and you're going to be saying to yourself, how can I get this thing fully actualized from the outset? And someone says, have you heard of Karl Barth? That's mutualist actualism up front at the very beginning. Yeah.
Hey, let me just throw in one quick thing, and then I can see Camden's teed up for our next question. But I will just say this: between we're talking about pure act, and we've dropped that out there a few times. We're talking about Barthian actualism, and I think sometimes people wonder what is the difference between what I kind of call hyper actualized God of Barth, the God who is actualizing himself, and like say the pure act that you find referred to, I mean, strangely in both Cornelius Van Til, Herman Bavinck, and Thomas Aquinas will all talk this way. What is the difference between pure actuality and Barthian actuality? And the difference is that Barthian actuality is an actualized actuality, whereas the actuality of Van Til or Bavinck or of Aquinas is in fact just the unbounded, pure, non-developed actuality of divine being. And I think that distinction, that's the distinction between something that becomes and something that instantly is.